Hey guys, Zazubaar here, and today I'm here to do a video that in a style I haven't done in quite a while. Usually my videos nowadays usually center around reviewing things and discussing things with people and other such things. But I haven't done a video in a while about creating my own stuff, but only talking about what I would do with certain characters. Like I've done this with Godzilla. I talked about my Godzilla trilogy a while ago. I talked about what I would do if I got my hands on the Power Rangers and mixed them with that 70s show, which was weird. And you guys can go check that out if you want to see that weird ass idea. I promise drugs were not involved in that. Anyway, so what we're going to be talking about today is another character I would very much like to be creatively involved with, and what I would do with that character if I got my hands on them. And the character we're going to be talking about today is Zorro. Yes, the masked avenger of pre-statehood California, as in when California was first run by the Spanish government and then run by the Mexican government, and then of course went on to become a state in the United States. But Zorro's mythology and the character of Don Diego de la Vega, Zorro's alter ego, takes place mainly within the Spanish-run California and Mexican-run California eras of history, just because that's when Zorro makes the most sense to be in place, because I don't really think there were Dons in California after it became a state, but I could be wrong on that. Anyway, so that's kind of when Zorro, his time period lies, and there of course been a plethora of versions of Zorro, ranging from the silent film era to pulp magazines to comic books to television to big budget films, video games. Anything you can think of, Zorro has probably been in. So Zorro obviously has had a wide exposure. I think probably the most famous versions are the Mask of Zorro, which is a very classic silent film, which is oftentimes cited as a major inspiration for Batman. In many Batman stories, like Batman Year One, really almost any Batman story, really. There are exceptions, like Batman Begins doesn't use this, but most Batman stories have, or Batman TAS doesn't use this, but most Batman stories have the movie that Bruce Wayne and his parents are seeing when the night that his parents get murdered be the Mask of Zorro, just because it makes sense for Bruce to have that image of a masked avenger imprinted on his mind the night his parents died, so that way it would make a little bit more sense when he would go on to become a masked avenger himself one day. It's just kind of a nice little irony. So that's oftentimes included in Batman stories. In Batman TAS, they did something a little different, probably because they couldn't get the rights to the character of Zorro. They created their own masked avenger called the Grey Ghost, who was actually played by Adam West, so that's cool. Anyway, this is not about Batman. So Zorro. Zorro is a character I was never really interested in. I never really knew anything about until a couple years ago, thanks to the movie The Mask of Zorro, which I think is probably the second most famous version of Zorro, with Antonio Banderas as Alejandro Murrieta, who was the second Zorro. In universe, Alejandro was the one who took over the mantle of Zorro from Diego de la Vega, who is probably the most famous. He is the main Zorro. Whenever you see Zorro having an alias, it's usually Diego de la Vega. Just in this case, I think they wanted to appeal to a younger crowd, and they wanted to have Antonio Banderas play a younger Zorro, so they didn't want to use Diego. So they had Diego be kind of the mentor character, and he was the previous Zorro. Anyway, so the Mask of Zorro is my favorite version of Zorro, just on film at least, just because everything about the previous versions is in that version of Zorro, and also Antonio Banderas is a fantastic Zorro, regardless of his alias. As Zorro, he nails it. The Mask of Zorro itself is a great movie. Anthony Hopkins as an old Diego de la Vega is awesome. So that film just really knows how to introduce its audience to the mythology of Zorro and get them interested in it. Because it manages to retain all of the aspects of the Zorro mythology, with only changing minimal things that even Zorro fans won't notice. Like Anthony Hopkins' Diego is a little bit, you know, he's not quite the same character that you usually see as Diego, but that's fine. It's not so different where it's insulting like Godzilla 98, but he plays Diego a little bit differently than I would have expected an older Diego. Anyway, we're not reviewing the Mask of Zorro. I just wanted to say that that's probably my favorite version of Zorro. That and also the Zorro costume looks awesome. The third and final most famous version of Zorro is probably the Guy Williams Disney TV show version of Zorro, which is another one of my favorite Zorro versions. That was around in the 50s when that show came out, and it's a really fun, aimed at children decidedly, but still fun, TV version of Zorro with some pretty cool action, some cool sword fights, and Guy Williams as Zorro, very, very well done as well. He is probably the definitive Diego de la Vega. Anyway, so now on to my Zorro. I would love to work on Zorro just because I love the character. I think he's very interesting. I love his visual aesthetic. I love his characterization. I love the idea of having someone be this kind of Robin Hood-esque political figure who he doesn't steal from the rich to give to the poor. He humiliates the rich to raise the poor, if that makes any sense. He tears down those who oppress others, humiliate them, and put the power in the hands of the people. He's very much so like the champion of the peasants. Zorro always fascinated me in that way. So what I would do with Zorro is I would do a couple of different things. I would obviously want to do a primary film series starring Zorro, that would just be called Zorro, where I would start out with an adaptation actually of a Zorro novel, a recent Zorro novel, which is one of the few things that actually details Zorro's origin. Not a lot of Zorro stuff is done about his origin. Most of it is just after Diego has taken up the mantle of Zorro. So what that novel does, it's just called Zorro. It's by an author named Isabel Allende, and I actually have not read this novel, but I have read and I actually own the graphic novel interpretation of it written by Matt Wagner. It's basically the same exact thing, just adapted for a graphic novel medium, and some things are changed to match Matt Wagner's desires to do with his comic book series, since after adapting that novel, he wrote his own Zorro stories. Anyway, so I would start out by basically closely adapting that Zorro story. Basically the way that Allende and Wagner present Diego's origin, from childhood to adulthood to becoming Zorro. Because that's definitely the best version of Zorro's origin. Basically the only one, since the other times we see Diego put on the mask for the first time, it's so simple that it's like, it's just there because usually it's done in the half-hour TV show. For example, the Guy Williams TV show, we get to see Diego decide to take up the mantle of Zorro, but it's so quick, it's like, why do they even bother? Obviously it's because it's a half-hour TV show, and their audience probably wouldn't have been familiar enough with the other versions of Zorro to work out his origin. But Diego basically just wanted to fight the oppression of his hometown in California, so he decided to put on a mask and to put his sword skills to the test, and became Zorro, with the explanation of taking the name as, if I cannot wear the head of a lion, I will wear the head of a fox. And that's why Zorro means fox in Spanish. So that's why he came up with the name of Zorro and the guise of Zorro. However, the Allende novel and the Wagner graphic novel both go into way much more detail on that, and I enjoy the detail. I would treat Zorro as a character similar to the way people treat like Shakespeare novels, or Shakespeare plays, excuse me. I know Shakespeare didn't really write novels, but Shakespeare plays, in terms of like the elaborate detail and the scope that people will treat a Shakespeare play. I recently saw the Kenneth Branagh version of Hamlet, and I'm not a fan of Shakespeare, but I enjoyed the production itself. I thought it was very, very impressive. And I looked at it and I was like, I don't like Hamlet, but I like this visual style. I would love to take that style and impose it onto Zorro. that kind of elaborate, very much so entrenched in the time in which it's set kind of setting. Because I think Hamlet takes place in 19th century Denmark. It's the Victorian era, so it's around that time. So it's actually not far off from Zorro's time period, just obviously in a different geographic setting, since it's in Denmark and Zorro is 19th century California. So it's not far off that I could kind of lift that visual style and apply it to Zorro. That, and also, I would also take what the visual style of the Mask of Zorro shows, with the kind of elaborate costumes and sets, and very much so entrenched in the time, and use that as a basis as well. But even more so, I would even want to more impose Zorro's time period onto the audience. I would want to show that, yes, this is the time period in which it takes place in. And not in a way where it's like, it's forcing it down their throats, like, this is 19th century California. No, I would do it in a way where they become interested in that time period, where they like seeing Zorro as a character in that time period. I would want them to imagine it like, this time period necessitates Zorro. Which is kind of the way the Mask of Zorro presents it and the way the novel presents it. So that's how I would do it visually. Story-wise, I wouldn't change much from the Allende novel. I would probably add a better villain, just because the novel itself doesn't really have a set that's the villain. And there's really not much of an overarching plot. It's a lot more just origin stuff, which is fine. But though I would add an overarching plot. I want Zorro to have a face to carve the Z in, if that makes any sense. And Zorro's big motif is he carves Z's when he does something. You know, when he defeats someone, he carves a Z around, or he carves it into them, like he does in the Mask of Zorro and how he does it in the novel. And I'm not saying the novel doesn't have a villain, it does, but the villain is very much so in the background until the last issue. And it's like, again, it's fine, it's way more focused about showing us how Diego became Zorro, but I like Diego to have someone to be a rival. It's better for Zorro to have someone to contrast to, because Zorro being a very selfless hero of the people kind of character, you need to have someone who accentuates and displays the thing that Zorro is trying to fight. You know what I mean? In the case of Zorro, it's better to have a face to attach to the enemy. Like someone like Batman, on the other hand, you've got villains in Gotham City, but Gotham City is much more so an infected area filled with crime. Crime is not supposed to have a face, really, in Batman. I like the idea of Zorro's oppression having faces, different enemies, but I would want to give Zorro a more defined villain. And not like a costumed villain in any way, since I don't really like the idea of Zorro having costume villains. I like the idea of Zorro being really the only costumed character in his universe. Usually he's just fighting government officials. But I would give a government official a lot of personality, a lot of character stuff. I would make him more of a fleshed out villain than the one in the novel. I think the one in the novel is just really a comandante. It's very simple, and he's not really even the central focus. He's also kind of a buffoon. So I like the idea of, I'm not saying Zorro villains should be more witty than Zorro. The point of Zorro is they're dumber than he is, and that's why he's able to defeat them so easily. But I like the idea of giving Zorro villains, you know, a better chance at giving Zorro a challenge, because in the movie The Mask of Zorro, Rafael Montero, who's Zorro's primary enemy, and Captain Love, the two primary enemies, they're not dumbasses. They're pretty smart. They're able to. I mean, one of them was able to defeat Zorro at one time, the Diego de la Vega one, and then Diego has to get a protege to take over, and that's how he's defeated. So, I mean, I like the idea of Zorro villains giving Diego or Alejandro, whoever's wearing the mask, a run for their money. That's what makes it exciting. So I would make the villains in my Zorro film a little bit smarter than the way Wagner presents them in his graphic novel. But again, just basic story-wise, the origin that Zorro has in that book, I would basically just adapt it word for word. The only other thing I would change is who's telling the story, because in the book, and again, I haven't read the Allende novel, but I have read the interpretation of it, so I'll stop saying Allende. In Wagner's interpretation of that story in his graphic novel, Bernardo, who is another famous Zorro character, who's kind of Zorro's Alfred, he's his manservant slash best friend slash confidant of being Zorro, he gives him, Bernardo is the one telling the story. Now, Bernardo is a mute character. He can't speak. In most cases, he just can't speak because he's a mute. It's a physical defect. In the book, it's a psychological defect. He watched his and Diego's mothers get raped by pirates. So, he just took an oath of silence, when his mother died, just kind of out of respect. So that's why that was in place. So I like that Zorro or Bernardo has had that. But, and I'd probably keep that intact in my version, just because that's a very interesting reason to have Bernardo be mute. But what I would change is I want to see the world through Diego's eyes. And the book very much so has it's more like Diego through Bernardo's eyes. Which, while interesting, is not the way I would want to tell my Zorro story. I would want to do it as the world through Diego's eyes. I would want to basically be I want to have Diego be the primary protagonist, with Bernardo as a secondary protagonist or a supporting character. I wouldn't want the story to be through Bernardo's eyes. I want it to be through Diego's eyes. It's fine in the novel. I'm not criticizing the novel, just for my sake and the version of Diego I would want to bring to life. I would use I would have Diego being the teller of his own story, and not narration wise, but just it's his story. It's through his eyes. Anyway, so that's really how I would handle my first Zorro movie, and that will be the first of a trilogy of Zorro live-action cinematic films. It would end just with Zorro's adversary returning to Spain after Zorro defeats them. I would also have a primary figure in Californian history pop up in the film, Santa Anna, who was you know, a major force in the Mexican Revolution. Be an ally of Zorro's, and they would Zorro would understand that he is the one who's going to relinquish control from the Spanish government and take over and kind of lead the people to a more free existence, and that's what Zorro would understand and want to see happen. So he would be Santa Anna's ally. Kind of like a little bit like a Commissioner Gordon Batman relationship, though a lot less steady. Like, Zorro would not trust Santa Anna that much, and Santa Anna would not trust Zorro that much. So Diego would assist Santa Anna in defeating the Spanish government. California would become part of the Mexican government, and then that would be the end of film 1. Film 2, I'm a little shaky on, because I would want to film... Probably the idea of Zorro 2 would be a transition film between the Spanish government to the Mexican government, and then the third film would be much more about, you know, dealing with that. This would be kind of a transition film where we understand that the Mexican government is just getting on its feet. Yeah, the Mexican government would just be getting on its feet. And obviously, I have to be playing around with history a little bit. It'd still be historical fiction. It wouldn't be just historical drama with Zorro put into it. It would obviously have to be... I'd have to be changing historical events and molding historical figures into what I need for my story. So I'm not saying that my Zorro films would be historical dramas, but they would be historical fiction. It'd be playing around with history, and I always liked that idea. Obviously, though, this would take a few years, so Zorro would be around for a while, putting out small fires and fighting oppression and all that. In between, Santa Anna and the the transition between the Mexican and Spanish governments. That being said, Zorro would still be around. It's not like Diego would give up being Zorro while the Mexican government was in place, because he probably still wouldn't trust them. So what would happen is the film 2 would be about Diego kind of still dealing with being Zorro. Film 2 would be a lot more like exploring what's being Zorro like, and it would be a much more self-contained story about what's being Zorro. I would give Diego a different enemy. I've always liked the idea of Zorro fighting different kinds of swordsmen, and it's something that's never really been explored in Zorro fiction. He's oftentimes just fought, people in his time period and his geographic location with a very specific kind of swordplay. Just as like a fight scene, I would like to see what would happen with, between, say like Zorro, a traditional Spanish swordsman, and something like a samurai. You know what I mean? Like seeing Zorro fight a samurai, like different kinds of swordplay, and how Zorro would deal with that. But as a villain, I would have maybe a Chinese kind of cult come into California and try to take it by storm while there's this really weak political period where we're transitioning between governments, and Zorro would have to keep them down. And this is how we'd be able to explore Diego being Zorro and the relations of that. So that's kind of what I would do with film 2. I have less details about film 2 than I do film 1. Zorro 1 would be called Zorro Trail of the Fox. And I would probably take the title of Matt Wagner's other Zorro trade, Zorro Clashing Blades, for Zorro 2. So, yeah, that would be Zorro 2, Zorro Clashing Blades. Because it just makes sense for the idea of I'm exploring Zorro fighting different kinds of swordsmen. So Zorro would basically be fighting samurais in Zorro 2 Clashing Blades. And it would be much more of Diego dealing with what being Zorro was like. The curses involved, the toils involved, and obviously the idea of political corruption. And I'd also have some of Diego's friends trying to turn on him and just join this Asian cult, wanting to see them take over California because they don't like the Mexican government that much. So Zorro would have to be... So as Diego, he would be fighting with his words, and as Zorro, he would be fighting with his sword. So that's kind of what I would be exploring Diego's dual personality traits in Zorro Clashing Blades. Zorro 3 would be my favorite of the trilogy. This is Diego's last ride as Zorro. The Mexican government has taken full hold. We would cut ahead a few years. Diego's been Zorro for a while now. He's getting a little tired. He's a little bit weathered. Santa Anna's control over Mexico and California would be complete. It's a well-established government, but Diego is still not satisfied. There's still oppression. There is still corruption, and he's still trying to stamp it out. He's still fighting for the people, and he can't seem to find a safe ground. And the big point of the film would be deciding whether or not we're ever going to have complete political stability and political peace. Obviously, we live in an imperfect world, so probably not, but the idea of Zorro would be continuing to fight for it. And Diego would be dealing with whether or not he can do this forever, whether or not he can continue to be Zorro, because Zorro will always be needed. And that will be the big question of the film. I also like the idea, and this I promise I wouldn't be stealing this from The Dark Knight, but in The Dark Knight, one idea is that Batman is inspiring others to put on a cape and cowl and go out there and fight crime, but they're doing it incorrectly. It made sense with Batman because that's kind of what Bruce was trying to do in Batman Begins, is to inspire others to do what he does, but he didn't want them to actually do it the way he does it. In my third Zorro film, since Diego would primarily be operating as Zorro in what would become Los Angeles, California, I think it'd be interesting for him to find out that other outlaws have put on masks and taken on different names, basically in the same style of Zorro in other parts of California and other parts of the world. And he finds out that people are dying because of it, that these people are getting slaughtered because they think they're associated with Diego. And the opening of the film would be Diego riding off. Well, you wouldn't really see him at first. It would be an execution of a masked bandit in a part of California where Diego doesn't operate as Zorro, and we would see Diego stopping an execution, and there would be a conversation between Diego as Zorro and this other masked guy as to what makes Zorro special, and as to whether or not he should let other people do this for him. And this would prompt Diego's character problem of, will we ever be able to stop, you know, this government idea? Anyway, the primary plot though would deal with this would be the only time I would give Zorro kind of a masked enemy. What would happen is Santa Anna and the Mexican government are not liking what Zorro's doing. They think Zorro has betrayed them, and they want him out of the way now, because he's making it hard for them to continue to have a grasp on California. And at this point, they're waging a war with the U.S., and their political holdings are getting weak. So Zorro is not making that any easier. So now Santa Anna wants Zorro dead, because he's making it hard for him to, you know, continue to be, you know, the controller of California. So he hires someone, or not hires someone, he makes a very strange ally. The enemy from the first Zorro movie, who would have a very symbolic scar on his face, a big Z. And now he's going around wearing an iron mask. And he arrives in California, and Santa Anna promises him some stuff, saying that I will give you power over California if you defeat Zorro for me. So the whole idea of this film would be Zorro combating him again, and the film would be called Zorro Must Burn. Doesn't that sound awesome? Anyway, so yeah, that would basically be the premise of Diego also kind of losing his hold on the people of California. The people of California are losing their faith in Santa Anna, but they're also losing their faith in Zorro, because these masked people are dying, and Zorro is screwing up a little bit. So they're kind of flocking to Santa Anna for, you know, safety, because they don't want, you know, they don't like Zorro anymore, just because he's not really fighting for them anymore, they don't feel. So they want Zorro's head a little bit, and it gets really bad by the end of the film, because Santa Anna makes himself out to be a martyr. So Zorro would kill him, and the people would want Zorro's head. So Zorro, in a fight with Santa Anna and in a fight with the villain from the first film, they're fighting in like Santa Anna's like estate, and Zorro would, as Diego, would be unmasked in front of all these people. And that would kind of destroy the point of Zorro, since the point of Zorro is that Zorro could be anybody. He represents the collective will of the people to fight for freedom. And if he's unmasked, the illusion of that is destroyed. Zorro is being oppressed, so the people are being oppressed. And I would want kind of a Jesus type thing where Diego would be not explicitly crucified, but he would be kind of mock crucified. He would be just hung with his mask off, bleeding, being whipped in front of all the people in Santa Anna's estate. And then there's a big fire. Diego fights his way out, but he's ultimately burned. He doesn't die, but he's very badly burned, very badly scarred, and he says, "I'm done. If the people don't want Zorro, what is Zorro?" So he gives up. He goes downriver, you know, licking his wounds along the way. Not really, not literally. But he gives up on being Zorro. He returns to his cave, and he's gotten a letter from someone in Spain, as Diego, not as Zorro. But it's someone he knew from when he was training to become Zorro when he was in Spain. That's a big part of the novel, is that Diego actually joins this secret organization in Spain, and this will also be part of the first movie, where they all take up masked avenger names and promise to fight for the people. Basically be Robin Hood type characters, and that's where Diego takes the name Zorro and comes up with the idea to wear a mask. So Diego would go back to Spain because there's nothing left for him in California. He's been unmasked, and him and Bernardo have to leave the Diego de la the De La Vega estate. At this point, Diego's dad has been dead for several years, dying of old age. Diego would have a love interest at this point, but he would have to leave her behind and go to Spain to escape the fact that the people want Zorro's head. So he's about to leave, but the Mexican army and the people have come to take down Zorro. They want Zorro's head. So they've come to the De La Vega estate and start to destroy it. And as Zorro, I don't know, I just think this would be cool to see Zorro being chased by the people. Diego would start to escape, but to make it easier for Diego to escape, and at this point his love interest would be coming with him because she doesn't want to leave him, Bernardo would sacrifice himself so that way Zorro could get out. Zorro rides off into the night. Bernardo is killed by the people as being an accomplice of Zorro. The De La Vega estate burns down, and Diego leaves. Excuse me. Anyway, so Diego returns to Spain, and he's been contacted by the secret organization, I forget their name, to lead it. He wants to, their leader recently died. Diego's mentor died recently, and they want Diego to run it. So he's come back to lead this organization. So the rest of the film would basically be, obviously California now is in the grasps of the Mexican government, who has made Santa Anna and a martyr. And the man with the mask who Zorro fought in the first film, you know, he would now be the head of California. And California is just falling apart. It's just not in good shape. But Diego has wiped his hands of it. He's in Spain. He's happy. And then eventually, he would be contacted by someone saying that California is just, they need Zorro again. It's in the same state that Diego left it when he first became Zorro. He needs to become Zorro again and save it. So he would realize that there will always need to be a Zorro. At this point, he would have kind of a mock son who he's taken in from the league from the secret organization, who I would be prepping to become the next Zorro, and he would be Alejandro Murrieta. So just so I can keep up the continuity from Mask of Zorro, just because I like that character. So they return to California. Alejandro helps Diego fight off the villain from the first film. Diego becomes Zorro again, defeats them. California is relinquished of control from the Mexican government. The United States comes in. Diego dies. And of course, Alejandro becomes the new Zorro. And Zorro will always be there. So that's the end of my Zorro trilogy. However, that's not the end of my Zorro stuff. I would like to do a lot of other stuff with Zorro. I would love to do a Zorro TV show. which I would kind of do as an anthology series. So I like the idea of Zorro being a legacy character, as in kind of like Robin or the Flash, where multiple people would come in and take up the mantle of Zorro. That will be, you know, that would mainly follow the De La Vega line. So after Alejandro, though, it would go back to De La Vega, since Diego's wife would give it to their son, and he would become the new Zorro. Then just it would keep on going. And my series would probably be called The Many Blades of Zorro. And it would just be about all the different men who have worn the Mask of Zorro all the way up until the present. So the eras I would primarily use, I would probably come up with more, would be some stories would be about Alejandro's time as Zorro, other times about Diego's son as Zorro, other times about a World War II Zorro who is a soldier, a De La Vega who's fighting in World War II on the side of America, fighting the Nazis, so he can more directly help, you know, the Jewish people. I don't know, I like that. I like the idea of seeing Zorro in World War II. I would basically play Zorro in time periods where it would make sense to have someone fighting for the people. I'd also probably have Zorro. It would probably end up being Diego's son or Alejandro who would actually fight in the Civil War, and get involved with, you know, slavery and all that. So there would be another Zorro that would probably end up being... It would probably make sense if that was Alejandro who would be involved in that. Then you would have a Zorro fighting in World War II, who would probably be one of Diego's descendants, who would become the new Zorro. A Zorro who would... they would all have different visual aesthetics, so I'd probably keep the World War II Zorro not looking too far off from the classic design. Though instead of a hat and a cape, it would be a trench coat and a helmet, but the same mask and sword and all that. So I'd have a Zorro fighting in World War II, which I think would be awesome, fighting Nazis. Since any character fighting Nazis is awesome, so Zorro fighting Nazis is just cool. I would also have Zorro combating, and this is a little bit more of a controversial idea, I'd also have Zorro, again, one of Diego's descendants, getting involved in the civil rights riots in the 1960s, and combating, you know, some of the oppression that was going on there, fighting alongside, like, protesters as, you know, the considered overkill of tactics that were used by, like, military and police officers taking down these protesters. And I would actually have that Zorro die. And that would be the final Zorro for a long time. And each, you know, the TV series would focus a couple episodes on each of these Zorros, telling their stories, their important accomplishments as the Masked Avenger, until we get up to the 60s Zorro. The 60s Zorro would be the one fighting the civil rights stuff. And I would have him die in one of the major famous protests. And Zorro would die at that point, because they would think, out of respect for him, out of respect for that De La Vega, he would, you know, there would be no more Zorros. Until probably, like, the modern day Zorro, like present day. And he would be fighting corruption in a modern day Los Angeles. And he would, it would be a very young... I would probably use I would actually probably have him be like Diego de la Vega III. Would be, excuse me, would be combating a variety of different things, of different political corruptions in our modern day society. And he would probably have an entire season devoted to him. Maybe even a new film series, I don't know. But that would be the modern day Zorro, who'd be riding a motorcycle. I would have, all the way since the World War II Zorro, riding motorcycles instead of riding horses. Everything before that would be riding horses, and until we got up to, like, you know, the present day, until we get up to World War II, they're riding horses, then from that point on they're riding motorcycles. Which is not a new idea with Zorro. There's been a multitude of different Zorros who ride motorcycles. And that would get up to the present day with the modern day Diego de la Vega combating political corruption. And I would probably give him masked villains or costumed villains just because, you know, fighting political corruption in our modern day society isn't quite seen as black and white as it would be, you know, back in the day fighting the Spanish government. So it'd be a little bit more controversial. Anyway, so that's my Zorro series. It will basically consist of a primary trilogy following Diego de la Vega back in, you know, 19th century California. A TV series following a bunch of different Zorros called the Many Blades of Zorro, from, you know, classic all the way up to present day. And then maybe a new film series following a modern day Diego de la Vega in, you know, modern day Los Angeles combating modern day political threats. That film series would probably go under the name of Zorro Rides Again. Anyway, so that's my Zorro series. Thank you very much for watching. If you guys would like to comment on what you guys think of my Zorro series, or comments about anything, just leave it in the comments. Leave a video response if you have an idea, if you have your own idea for Zorro, or anything, or any other character you have an idea for, leave that in the video responses. So thank you very much for watching. I'm Zazubaar. Farewell.